prepared a message today for tonight that I've entitled "When the Moon Hits Your Eye," and it's been somewhat inspired by, I get into these phases of astronomy. I just like to stargaze once in a while, and I've kind of been in that phase lately. Also inspired by the song I always heard my parents play growing up from Dean Martin, the greatest Italian of them all. And I know it's an odd verse for Sukkot. It doesn't directly deal with Sukkot, but I like it because it talks about the part where God created the sun and the moon and the stars, and how he set them in place, and they marked off seasons. And there's an indication there that right at creation, God had something ongoing planned that was going to be cyclical and repeat itself. There was going to be anything but boring. And men were to dictate their lives according to it and live their lives according to it, the seasons and that these things brought, or the seasons that these things marked off. There's a lot of verses I could have picked that dealt directly with Sukkot from Deuteronomy itself. It's a very beautiful command. It commands us to be joyful during this time of Sukkot. And I used to wonder, how do you do that? How do you just decide to be joyful? But as I study more and more about it in this season, it has to do with the presence of God. And how could you be anything else but joyful? I think the Apostle Paul tells us to set our mind on heavenly things. Well, Sukkot was a season for that, for setting your mind on higher things. It was a way of life. I could have chose the verses from John where Yeshua actually went to the festival of booths and tabernacles. And on the 8th and greatest day of the feast, he made this great statement, "All who are thirsty, let him come to me and drink." Very significant for what that 8th day meant, and you could look it up, what that water ceremony or tradition or commandment actually meant in regards to Sukkot. So I could have chose any of those verses, but I chose the verses from Genesis. And before we read them, since we didn't really have a blessing, Alan's going to do the Torah blessing because he's a better cantor than me. And if it is a time to be joyful, my voice isn't the one you want to hear singing. So,
you have a good voice. Baruch hu et Adonai hamvorach. Baruch Adonai hamvorach li'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam. Asher bachar banu mikol hamim. V'natan lanu et Torto. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Amen.
Hans, if you could put the verses up on the screen. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years." I particularly like that, to mark sacred times. "And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. It was a pretty important fourth day. When I think of the cycles and the seasons that God created, the fall feast for me kind of bring that to the forefront of my thinking. And I always feel that it's a time for us to increase our awareness or our sensitivity toward the Lord. Not that God isn't relevant and active in every other season in our life or in the lives of this world. He's supposed to be in the forefront of our minds, but it seems like at this time of year, there's an increased awareness of him, which is probably human nature. I think of the 4th of July. People will fly their flag that day and not any other days. On the 4th of July, people may have 3 hot dogs instead of the usual 2 at the picnic. And Christmas time, when people will send a warm greeting card to people they haven't really seen in a long time, or they feel more generous. And not that the high holy days are supposed to be just this one significant time where you pay attention to God and that's it. It really is a reminder to pay attention to God through the whole year. And I think it's intended by the Lord for us to be aware of that connection, make a greater connection with him, reaffirm our faith and our connection with him. Because God's desire for man is that he's to be experienced, that God wants us to experience him And I believe that that was his desire at creation. God created us because he wanted fellowship with us. He created us to worship and be active in him, but God desired to be with us. And I think of that through this time of year, how it's kind of a twofold experience. It's us being aware of the Lord and God making us aware that he's aware of us as well. I subtitled this message, Looking at God, Looking at Us, because that's what I think it feels like sometimes. That's what I think Sukkot is supposed to be. And I'm reminded that connection becomes very sacred and very important and very close, and it's a continual thing that goes on and on. God was meant to be experienced by Israel, and when he brought them into the desert, that was his intention. And I love the order that the feasts fall in at this time of year. I mean, we have Rosh Hashanah, which I could look at as a beginning, or new beginning, or a renewal of something, setting forth on this journey, setting out on this new thing. And then, to me, this covenant-based second one of Yom Kippur, atonement, forgiveness of sins. Because when you think of atonement and mercy of God and forgiveness is completely about relationship with God. And that was the most covenant-based aspect of it, that God wanted this relationship with Israel. Didn't start off really well, but no matter what, God loved them so much and loves us so much that forgiveness is essential to his heart as well, not just to spare us from this eternal punishment or from punishment in this world. It's an expression of his desire of a restored relationship. And when you hear people forgive, when believers talk about forgiveness, it has to be more than just checking a box because we're obligated to. If somebody offends me, well, yes, I have to do the right thing, the scriptural thing, and forgive him. I don't know if you ever heard people say, and with no small degree of pride, I can forgive, but I can't forget. And I thought, that's not really the same thing. It's not really Messiah-like, because we're told that God casts our offenses into sea of forgetfulness. And if we enter into forgiveness with that attitude, well, we're kind of missing the point. We really haven't forgiven anything. It's kind of pride-based. It's obligated-based. It's not love-based. It doesn't have an eye on restored relationship, which is what the relationship with God and Israel was all about, why Day of Atonement was necessary. God could not break his own order and his own commandments, but at the same time, he couldn't stand to see his people perish. What a dilemma. What does he do with that? He fulfills the law out of his love, and he restores that relationship with his people, Israel. He restores that relationship with us. It's an incredibly love-based, covenant-based feast day. But then those 2 days set the stage for Sukkot, which I think is the meat of the issue. It's the in-between part. It's the life that we're supposed to live every day, between the miracles, between the deliverances, between the promised land. Remember when Israel was actually living in booths, that was their way of life. They weren't really, at that point, commemorating a feast day. They weren't doing it just 8 days out of the year. This was their way of life for a long time in the desert. And they saw many things. As Saul said, their shoes didn't wear out. They saw many acts of God, but they saw, I'm sure, a lot of days where they were just waiting. And up until that point, God spoke to Adam, he spoke to the patriarchs, spoke to Moses, but in the desert, they all heard the thunder on the mountain. They all, when God spoke and when he moved, all of a sudden, it seemed like everybody had access to him. They were open, they could see him, and they could follow him, and he was relevant and active in their lives. And this all happened in the wilderness. It didn't happen in Egypt when they were delivered. They saw great miraculous things there, and they weren't in the promised land yet. They weren't going to get to the promised land and then discover God, and then discover the nature of God. In the wilderness, God told them everything about himself. He showed them everything about his nature. God is not the bookends of our life. He's not just the beginning, and he's not just there when we die. God didn't create us and say, well, I'll see you when you get to heaven. Good luck. I hope you make some good choices, and I hope good things happen to you. Actually, now, in our lifetime, in this in-between, the days in between, is when God is the most relevant. It's when he's the most active. It's where he's supposed to be recognizable, where he's supposed to be at the forefront, not just on our periphery, not just there when we have anxiety or we're sick, when we're doing the same job every day I've been doing mine for 28 years, same job, same people, same customers I talk to. But you know what? I'm a vastly different person than I was 28 years ago. And I learn more and more, as we all do, to see God in the mundane and the everyday things, and it's not boring. It really gives meaning to everything we do. And what I like about these verses that I chose is that it talks about that. It talks about the ongoing cycle of life over and over again. The same moon rising, the same sun rising, the same moon setting, the same sun setting. It's not boring. It's just the growth. I mean, the earth and the universe, the way God created it, is expanding, and it's continuing. It's alive. It recycles itself. And there's evidence of God in everything we see, in everything we do. And I love the part in the Psalms where I believe it was David who asked the Lord, teach us to number our days. Because that's the part of Sukkot that I like. That's the part of Sukkot that we're called to. That's what Sukkot is supposed to teach us, to number our days. We're in this wilderness, and we're moving day by day, sometimes doing the same thing every day. Sometimes there's great events, sometimes there's nothing. But still, if you're not finding God in the small things as well as the big things, we're not really numbering our days. And there's evidence of him in all these things. I think it was in the wilderness that God completely revealed himself, his nature, to Israel. When they left Egypt, it was with great signs and great miracles and plagues and the Red Sea parting and closing over the Egyptians. God showed him his power, showed him how great he is. When they left Egypt, you remember how God played with Pharaoh's heart? I don't know if played is the right word, but how he hardened it, and then he softened it, and then he hardened it. This was the greatest king in the known world. This was the greatest, most powerful, most fearful, fearsome country in the whole entire known world. And they had no authority over the things of God. Pharaoh would declare something, and he had the power to do it. And, well, look what happened to him. He's somewhere, his army got drowned. He was confounded at every step. God could have just caused a miracle and had him walk out of Egypt, but he had to show his authority too, that he was the King of Kings, that he was the King of Kings and presidents in this world. It's where he showed him his power. It's where he showed him his authority. And in the wilderness, it's where he showed them his heart and his affection toward them, because he was with them. That's the part I love about it the most, is not that he was on his throne in heaven causing miracles and provision to be thrown down at them. He was present with them. He saw their comings and goings. He saw their bad days. He saw their good days. He saw their rebellious days. He saw their joyful days. Every one of them. He was with them and he was present. And the call to Israel, just like the call to us today, is to be aware of that presence and move in it and walk in it. I don't know of any king or president in this world who would leave their palace or their throne and come down and dwell with the lowliest of their people. I didn't really watch the debate the other night, but I'm not sure I want these candidates to do that after the way they acted. I don't know if I want these kings. And every once in a while, the presidents of this country will do a photo op. I remember years ago, about 5 years ago, President Obama came to Buffalo to have chicken wings at Duff's. It's just like it's an everyday thing. And I get it, it's politics, it's campaigning, and it's a logistical nightmare for a president to just show up and have a normal day. So I get that. But, he doesn't do that every day. I don't think he sat in the White House and says, hey, let's go to Buffalo and watch a Sabres game, have some wings, and go bowling with the nice folks in Buffalo, New York. Presidents don't do that. Presidents don't leave their palaces like that unless it's a photo op. Presidents live in their palaces and their White Houses and their great halls. But according to Scripture, sometimes the greatest things of God, the most powerful things of God, the divinity of God is found in the least likely places. And you think about that when Yeshua entered this earth. Presidents don't shake hands with lepers. They shake hands with dignitaries. Royal birth announcements are made from palaces by news media. They're not made in a shepherd's field among sheep until to go to the least of these towns, to go to a stall, a covering for animals to feed and see the King of Kings there and walk away praising him. Kings and presidents of this world don't do that. Kings and presidents of this world make speeches from great halls, from the Capitol building, from great halls around the world, from auditoriums. But the creator of the universe dwells in booths with his people with holes in the roof. So just maybe they could find him in their lowliest, loneliest moments. Kings and presidents don't think like that, but the King of the universe, what a comfort to know that he's observant. What I love about God, I think, one of the things I love the most, one of the many things, is that he observes us day to day. They say that a great artist, especially the Impressionists like Van Gogh, if you look at their work, it portrays everyday people sometimes doing everyday tasks. They say great artists, great songwriters are observers of people, and they learn their hearts. They learn about people that way. And I think the Lord has done that. I picture God as this father walking through the camp in Israel, going booth to booth, looking on his children sleeping the way a proud father would, looking lovingly on his children going through the camp of Israel. Or maybe the lover from Song of Songs going through the streets, looking for her, putting his hands through the lattice and standing at the door and knocking, because he just wants to come in. He just wants to have that fellowship with us. God is an observer of people because he loves us and he's aware of us. And one of the greatest, most comforting things for me is that God is aware of me at my worst. God is aware of me at my best. And he walks where he leads me to walk, and he's there. One of my favorite accounts in the gospel is the account of the widow's mite. It's usually used for tithes or offerings, where this widow comes up, puts one coin into the offering box, and Yeshua says, well, I tell you, she's given more than everybody else, because they, out of their abundance, have given, but she gave all that she had. Well, there's a great teaching there about giving and giving your full heart to God and everything you have to God, but go back and read that account when you get the chance. I love the way it starts off. It says that Yeshua and the disciples were near the temple watching her, that Yeshua was observing her and watching her. And isn't it almost joyful that this woman probably had no idea that he was watching her? In fact, she probably had no clue that centuries later, people around the world would be reading about her, because Yeshua sat on the step and just watched this common woman put a coin into the box. And if she's with him, and I gather that she is in his kingdom, maybe she's saying, you know what, I've done that a lot. Every time I got a coin, I did it. And he's probably saying, I know, and I watched you do it every time. I watched you do it every time you did that. Nobody else watched it. Nobody else paid attention to her. She didn't even know it. What a great thing that the greatest king, the King of Kings, the maker of the universe, watches what you do. You know, when you shovel your neighbor's driveway in January and you're out there and it's 5 degrees and all you're thinking about, I want to get this done, have coffee, then shower and go to work. And Yeshua is thinking that's the most important job that was done in the world, in the entire world today. More important job done that you just did, that was more important than kings or presidents just did, because it was his heart. There's these moments I call Sukkot moments, where it's a common moment and you share it with God. And sometimes it's the most beautiful thing of your day, and it's not miraculous, it's not really testimony worthy, although I'm going to tell one now. But as a few weeks back, I was sitting on the front porch before work, just having coffee, and must have rained the night before, but there was this flock of birds, hundreds of them. They were grackles, I believe. The little gray birds looked like sparrows, but smaller. And they were all over my lawn and my neighbor's lawn. They were picking, getting their breakfast, getting their worms. And there were so many that you could not walk from driveway to driveway without stepping on them. It was like a carpet. So I'm sitting there watching them, and very close. They're just a few feet away from me. And all of a sudden, 2 of them take off, and then the whole flock takes off. And you hear this incredible whoosh. It was like 1,000 umbrellas being opened. And I thought, well, that's a Sukkot moment, because they had purpose for being there, and they were feeding. And when they flew, they go in this wave, and they all curve at the same time. It's incredible to watch, but that sound was nothing like I've ever heard before. I've heard birds take off before, but did you ever hear that when there's a flock of them? And it was so loud, and I'll never forget it. If you ask me about that event 5 years from now, I'll tell you every detail about it, because I never forgot it. And I thought, wow, what a moment to share before the Lord. Before I went about my everyday, there was nothing special about that day. Talked to the same customers with the same problems and blah, 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 and this and that. My sign won't light, this and that. And, I want to say, well, nobody died. Let's be calm here. But God is in those Sukkot moments. It's the miracles sometimes are between the miracles. The fact that God sees us, the fact that God is present, the fact that God is aware of our circumstances, which means he's in them, which means you could talk to him anytime, and he would move in them at any time. And it's not always the miraculous testimonies that we need. Those are great, but to have God in the everyday, to be aware of the everyday, and to find his presence and to connect to it, to be aware that God's aware of me is really, what a reason to wake up in the morning. What a reason to wake up that God watches me from moonrise to moonrise every day of my life. And that's what the situation was for Israel in the desert. God was showing them these things. God was showing him the most beautiful part of himself. It's why he gave them the law in the desert. He didn't wait till they got to the promised land. They heard him thunder from the mountain. They heard these laws, and these laws dealt with every detail of their life, with their work, with how they are to be with one another, with their business, with their planting, with their plowing, with their harvesting. But most of all, at the end of the day, it was all about the relationship with him and the relationship with each other. He was teaching them to see his signature and his trademark and everything that was created. He was teaching them to be aware of him, and he was teaching them to be aware of each other too, because those commandments told us how to love one another as well, to see him in your neighbor. After working all day under the presence of God and hearing these laws and these commandments and living them out, could a man actually go into his booth at night and evil speak his neighbor with these holes in the roof where he's looking up, seeing what God created? It wasn't so much a testing ground, and I've heard the wilderness called a testing ground. I guess it was. But it really was the establishment of Israel. Israel was established as people of God before they got into the promised land. They couldn't go into the promised land not knowing him. Or else how could they have an effect on the nations? How could they have an effect on their enemies? They had to know God and know him intimately and carry him. When you think about it and you read about their experience in the wilderness, you don't read any account of any Israelite doing anything great or accomplishing anything great or anything historic, anything noteworthy. It was all the hand of the Lord. And I think sometimes the modern church, at least in this country, they're very accomplishment-based. Believers always seem like they're trying to define themselves and redefine themselves spiritually. Just today I was driving and saw a bumper sticker with all the Christian bumper stickers, and then there was a big bumper sticker on the rear window that said, "I'm a self-made man." And I thought, boy, that's kind of sad, because what does that mean? That's going to perish. I have a friend of mine, Pastor L. Bond at the Tabernacle, a very good friend of Alan and Rabbi, and he gave me this great analogy a few months back. He called it an ox cart theology, that believers will sometimes have this ox cart theology where we're going to put our faith in government or in education or in accomplishment, in career. And he said, not that those are bad things, but he referenced when David was bringing the ark back to Jerusalem, and he put it on an ox cart. And it didn't always go that well. It didn't always go right. It was a good intention, and maybe it kind of got the job done, but the ark was meant to be carried on the shoulders of priests, not on an ox cart. And when a religious organization or any people of faith, even as individuals, we try to bolster our accomplishments, to define ourselves, to say this is what God is doing. God caused me to overcome. We hear so many sermons about overcoming faith and victory and onward Christian soldiers and marching on to victory. Those are great, but you know what? In Israel's case, they were in the desert with God, and he was leading them where they were going, and he was showing them more and more of himself. That was the victory. They didn't bring any great victory into the nations. They didn't defeat Pharaoh. God did that. And when that was made known, some of the nations were very afraid of their God. They were not afraid of Israel. They were afraid of Israel's God, and they say that. It's that ox cart theology that they didn't have in the desert. They didn't have, all they had was these boots, and they had the presence of God. Did they see miracles? Well, probably, but probably not every day. But the real miracle was that he was present with them, that he was moving in their lives, and they had an identity. Their only identity was through him. Otherwise, their identity was slavery. If they would have even overthrown Pharaoh and gone out into the desert without God, Well, what do you think would have happened? He would have caught him. Or if they would have made it to the nations, well, these people are slaves. I mean, they're just not strong enough right now. They're very weak, sometimes pathetic. Were they sometimes pathetic in the wilderness? And God was never pathetic, and God still brought them out. Psalm 104 is a psalm that's traditionally read this time of year at Sukkot, and it's a beautiful psalm. It talks about the completeness of God and the completeness of his universe and creation, how he created everything, the earth, the sun, the moon. I particularly like the part when it talked about the animals. They have joy when God feeds them, but they're in anguish when God turns his face away. There's one verse where it says, he created the seas where Leviathan goes to frolic. The only purpose, I mean, he watches this big fish frolic and play. If he does it to an animal and he cares that much for them, how do you think he views us when we're having a day at work where maybe not even thinking about him like we should, and he's watching us. He just observes us and he watches us over and over again. And like that day in the port, sometimes he just wants to show you his beauty or something he did to remind you of who he is. Like when these birds took off, he's the first thing I thought of. And I'm not having these spiritual thoughts all the time. I don't want to portray myself as going around thinking, gee, I'm really super spiritual, and I see a bird and I think of God right away. Sometimes I think, boy, I hope he doesn't mess my windshield. But God wants to show us his beauty. I'm reading a book currently. It's called First Man. It's a biography of Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon. And in the months leading up to Apollo 11's flight, the United States invited 50 world leaders to write something profound for him to take up on the moon. So they did. And they were carved on this big brass plate. Then it was photographed and shrunk down to a microfiche, and people of my age will know what that is, and brought up to the moon, and it's still there today. And most of them wrote something about this profound accomplishment of mankind and what man can do and achieve these great heights. And they asked Neil Armstrong, Commander Armstrong, what his favorite verse was, or his favorite offering was. And he said it was from the president of the Ivory Coast. And he said, when you get to the moon, remember to tell it how beautiful it is when it shines its light on our Ivory Coast evenings. And he said that just moved him. And he said when he got back from the moon, his life was kind of hard because that's all he wanted to talk about was his accomplishment. And he felt it wasn't an accomplishment, it was a gift that he was given. And he did tell the moon that. The moon was beautiful. I think that's what the part that God wants to show us. When you look at the sukkah, the way it's built, when you go inside it, it's open at the top. You can't look to your neighbors to the left. You can't look to your neighbors to the right. They couldn't look to the nations while they were in there. All they could see was this opening in the sky and be reminded of not only who's providing for them, but how beautiful he is when he shines on their wilderness nights. Ever just look at the moon and get captivated? I have this app on my little notebook here, and it's called Sky Finder, and I'll show it to you later during the Oneg. It's kind of cool. You could, when you go to it, you could point it at a star. It'll tell you what that star is. You could find the planets and things like that. You can find the Hubble telescope and International Space Station. It's cool. I'll show you later. But that was the app that God gave to Israel in the wilderness. Here I am. This is my signature. It's like a painter. You can say a painter's beautiful. You can analyze the brushstrokes of a Van Gogh painting. But you have to admit, Van Gogh painted it. He was a real person. He painted it, and it was beautiful. And that's the beauty of the sukkah. Today, as I come to a close here, we have the sukkah life, and we have the presence of God still, and we have this awareness, or we're supposed to have this awareness of his presence in our worst of times, in our best of times. When you go to bed at night, if you had the worst day of your life, it's not like he went away. He's still peering at you, looking through the holes in that roof. And if you're just crying out to him, he's hearing you like a father who's coming to his child's room when he hears them cry in the middle of the night. He's that lover looking for that jilted beloved that he's looking for. The presence of God is the miracle in our life, and we get to see him every day. And if I could just encourage one thing from anything I said tonight, is to number our days that way. We live a Sukkot life still. It's a temporary world we live in. We live a Sukkot life. It's a lot of work. For Israel, it was a lot of work. I heard one rabbi refer to it as the schlepping feast day, because it was tearing up and building up and tearing down and building up and tearing down and moving here and there, and just depending on God for the next day's provision. And looking at that same pair of shoes that they had that never wore out. So today we have that presence, and this is the season that we not only press into it, we're reminded of the newness of life at Rosh Hashanah. We're joyful at the restored relationship we have on Yom Kippur. Sukkot is where we live those things out. Amen.